So I would say to you that it is such an honor, really, to meet you and to share space with you right now, because what you do is empowering for what I do. How do I circumvent this system? How do I crash it and bring it down when it and I was thinking about it this morning. So I'm using two words. The people that it benefits are different from the people that profit from it. Does that make sense what I'm saying? And so when I'm
Absolutely.
dealing with everyday people in my community, as I'm trying to do reform and actually close this facility down, I'm dealing with people who benefit from it, right? But then the people who profit from it use the people that benefit from it as that shield of kind of separating us so that we don't see the commonalities in the fight. And I always knew it was about money. I actually call it Louisiana's coal mines because people say Hillary Clinton really shot herself in
Mm,
the foot going to coal mine country, saying, I'm going to close the coal mine down without having first explained that I want to replace it with something that's not going to kill you. Um, and so that's
mm,
kind of what I see in my community is that this is their coal mine. Rural areas that are mainly their economy is the prison, right? Everybody works there, or the ancillary spokes of it all. How do we put that in a form that is so plain for people to understand? And then the corporations that benefit from it are so far removed from the day to day people that are actually being targeted by it that it's almost hard to make that connection until I found Worth Rises. And I just want to thank you for that. So I am just really honored to be here with you. And I want to thank you because the work that you do in real time is going to help grassroots organizations, like myself and like so many, I'm sure, that have reached out to you to thank you, to really get down to the nuts and bolts to be able to show people how this slavery system actually really works.
yeah, thank you so much for having me, and also, for all your work. I think I just want to really reciprocate the honor, right, to be here, and to be sitting with you and to be having this conversation, and thank you for you sharing your story, which I know is painful and hard and difficult, and also critical to the work, right, that we uplift when we discuss these things, because I mean, you're right in every sense, right? One thing that you were just talking about, the curriculum that we put out at Worth Rise, is about the prison industry. And what we say is knowledge is power, right? We know that. We know that when you know something, it is
Mhm.
much, much, much easier to combat it and harder for others to put spokes in your wheel, right? When you have the information that you need to fight a powerful system. This system is one that feeds off of a lack of transparency, right? It feeds off of people who are unaware of how the system operates.
Mhm. Exactly.
And that's what it relies on in many ways in order to not just cause the harm that it does, not just to prey on people, but to expand that predatory behavior. So, I say we can yell from the steps of every Capitol building in the country, but there are people in that Capitol building having meetings behind closed doors
Mhm.
who you don't see, who you don't hear, but who have a tremendous amount of influence and power that comes in the form of green paper, right?
Yeah.
And that's the part that we're trying to unpack in many ways so that we're not selling our freedom in the way that bail requires us to. And
Mhm.
that's what's really reprehensible about the system, is people will trade a lot to be free, because that's what we all want. So I think over and over we see this system just really attacking our communities in the most difficult ways. And sort of alluded or talked about how dependent certain communities are on prisons and jails for jobs, or other things that are related to the prison industry. And I like to refer to that as what we call human trafficking, right?
Mhm.
It's like notion that we will pick black and brown bodies out of urban, in large part, communities and ship them up to rural communities for white jobs.
Yeah.
Right. And that, I think you rightly paralleled it to the coal industry. It's like, we want to acknowledge that coal is bad and the way that prison is bad, but also understand that people need jobs and, all of these things. It's like, how do we find you better jobs? But regardless of whether we can or cannot find you better jobs, what we cannot do is be trafficking other people so that you have one.
Amen.
Yeah,
Amen.
where the black and brown bodies become the economic inputs, right?
Mm-hmm.
But not to mention, like, what it's often not talked about, and there's been study after study about it, which is that communities that latched on to the prison boom for economic, their economic stability, actually today, over that time since the 80s, 90s to now, have seen slower economic growth in communities
Yes.
that actually pursued other ventures and other ways to boost their economy. So it's critical for folks to understand that prisons are sort of a band-aid to some kind of job crisis that is neither good for the economy of your community, nor is it good for the mental health of your community, because correctional jobs are not good jobs.
Mm-mm.
So let's ask about one of those state capitals, because we just happen to have you here on a day where New York Governor Kathy Hochul has announced there are a number of really sad parallels, along with this. One, it's gotten no news attention yet. If you just look on the news coverage of her announcement, all you get is her gleaming, friendly press release at this point, and no actual, news articles that she wants to start contracting prison labor again in the state of New York, which in her terms sounds like a nice way to reduce recidivism and provide job training before people get out. However, what she leaves out is that maybe the state will garnish half of their wages, and that the reason states are allowed to do this is granted to them under the 13th Amendment, which otherwise abolished slavery. And how do we, I know how we hold Kathy Hochul and people like this accountable, but how do we talk through that to people who say, oh, well, this seems okay?
Thank you so much for raising that. It's really sad to see what's happening in New York. And it's sad for so many reasons. I think you bring up one, which is the reality of the 13th Amendment has an exception clause in it. We recently did polling and found that roughly 88% of Americans do not know that the 13th exception, which is purported and celebrated for having abolished slavery, has an exception clause in that allows for this enslavement and involuntary servitude of people who have been convicted of a crime as punishment for that crime. We are leading work at the federal level behind the abolition amendment to end that exception, and encourage folks to visit www.endtheexception.com to actually tell their Congress members to do that. So that's where that starts, right? It starts with that exception in the 13th Amendment. And then you start really bleeding that down into the states and into other federal law. And so many states also include this exception in their state constitutions, and states that don't are silent on the issue, right? Which means that the 13th Amendment prevails, right? And so unless you're explicit about the issue, in your state, it is legal for slavery and involuntary servitude to be used as criminal punishment. And so taking us to New York, this program that Governor Kathy Hochul is looking to introduce actually has its roots in federal law. It is not a new or unique program. It's a program that was actually started by federal law in 1979 under what was called the Prison Industries Enhancement Certification Program. Lovely name.
Yes.
The program basically allows, once again, for the contracting of prison labor to private sector, private vendors, private corporations. A practice that in large part, fell out of favor with convict leasing back in the 1920s. And so in New York, the Constitution, in fact, very explicitly states that private use of labor is unlawful. So in order for Governor Hochul to actually implement her new policy, which is just an extension of this federal law, often referred to as the PI program, and introducing that in New York would actually require a state constitutional amendment.
Mm.
That is quite a high bar to try to introduce private use of prison labor in your state, in a state that is, in many ways touted for being progressive and liberal. We are looking to reintroduce private use of labor. And so one thing that is, really critical in understanding that is that there is also a campaign that we helped launch a few years ago called 13th Forward that is currently led by Legal Aid Society, Color of Change, Night Clue, and Citizen Action, that has been fighting since its launch to end forced labor, to increase wages, to establish employment protections for people who are incarcerated, to do the things that we actually should be doing in 2022 to eradicate slavery and every vestige of slavery from our system. And so while advocates are pushing for those type of amendments to the state constitution and not getting traction with the governor's office, the governor is instead moving backwards and deciding, why don't we let private sector, private corporations have access to this prison labor, knowing that they can be forced into labor, knowing that they have no right to necessarily prevailing wages. And as you notice, even in her legislation, which does allow for prevailing wages, is frankly required by the federal law, would allow for 50% garnishment of wages, no employment protections. This is what she's willing to do. The good news is that in order to amend the state constitution in New York, it takes passage of legislation in 2 separate legislative sessions and a ballot initiative. That means in order for Governor Hochul to do this, it is a minimum of 2 to 3 years to have the state constitution actually amended, which means a number of things. It means that we have time. It means that we as New Yorkers have power, and that we should be exercising that power to ensure that we are actually working towards finally abolishing slavery once and for all, and not reinstituting the ugliest parts of our history.
It's amazing how even in this day and age, we can see things plainly in our face and not even realize that they're going on. I've been to the state capitol in Louisiana, and you've got beautiful men and women there in orange jumpsuits who are working in the kitchens feeding the legislators as they're coming through. And I remember when one of our Black Lives Matter activists had come through for when Alton Sterling was murdered in Baton Rouge. And he was like, "You guys are okay with this? This looks like a plantation. This is exactly what this is, And we can definitely hold Angola in Louisiana as one of the major prison plantations, in the world, not just the United States of America. And so dissecting this down, there were people, and I would tell them, slavery has not truly been abolished. They're like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, because of that clause. But I must be frank in saying that I was even unaware of the strides that have been made in some of the states that have actually amended their constitutions to take that out. And so the work has to be done. That education is paramount, Bianca. I mean, it is amazing how many of us are still in the dark about that and living, actually being targeted by these initiatives,
And it's not just that they benefit from a lack of transparency, like Bianca points out. It's also a subject material that a lot of the public would frankly not like to know about that benefits them as well, right? And we have #prison that we want to ask you about.
Yes.
And that makes me, disclaimer, I'm not a crypto bro, and we had to look that up and figure out how to say it. But you launched #prison on Twitter, and you do that for the non-technologically savvy like me by using the $ instead of what used to be the pound sign, but is now the hashtag sign. And you can search it with #prison. and you're showcasing and pulling back the curtain on people that are profiting off of human suffering. So how's it going? I think is a good way to start.
Absolutely. And like you, cash tags was not something I was very familiar with before I started.
It's what the kids are
cash
talking
tag,
about. It's what
right?
the kids are talking about.
Before I started cash tag prison, but it is sort of the perfect emblematic, I think, label, right, that we can use for this industry. It puts what it puts first, dollars,
Mm-hmm.
and attaches them to prisons and caging and surveillance and everything that comes with it. So hashtag prison started honestly in an accident. So I was, every day I get these Google alerts. I have a whole bunch of things that I like to flag, to read about. And, every day I get my little group of Google alerts. And on that particular day, this was a few weeks ago, I had seen a number of companies and things going on that were just really infuriating. Banks that were helping underwrite loans for certain prison services companies, and you sort of name it, there was just like all flooded in my inbox. And I was like, I feel like people don't know this, right? Not that I know people don't know this, right? People do not know that the banks they bank with, the companies that they're the executives that they like honor on their museum boards, or that are owners of their favorite like basketball teams and football teams, are engaged in this industry and preying on their communities. And so, I sort of quickly took to Twitter, as one does when they have something to say. No one to listen. No, I'm joking. So I and I posted, I said, look, it's time we talk about the prison industry. And if you're interested in learning about the prison industry and who's involved, and it's going to be deeper than, is McDonald's using or not using, right? It's really about the core of this industry, an industry that has more than 4,000 corporations in it, right? What does that look like? For everybody, Linda, who's not going to read the curriculum, right, and do the curriculum, I was like, here is one way to do a quick, every day, your daily tidbit on what is the prison industry. And so, I encourage people to follow along. And I was really blown away by the response, right? The tweet sort of went viral, and, within 2 days, and over 60,000, likes and retweets and whatever else happens on Twitter. And then I realized I signed up for something I didn't need to sign up for.
As one does on Twitter.
Right? A daily thread of information, and committing to news sources only. Without having to go deep into the treasure boxes. I always tell people there's plenty of things very active. You don't need to go that far into history to see really egregious corporate behavior. And I also think, things change over time. So I tell people all the time, don't repeat the things you've heard about brands you've heard about, because a lot of that information and data is outdated. But what we're doing with hashtag prisons is really giving the right now. Who are the corporations? What are they doing? How are they impacting people's lives? How are they in many ways destroying and harming people's lives? So that people see not just the corporations, which is important, but even when a corporation isn't familiar to you, that you see the practice and you see the policies and you see the impact and you see the people, and you are enraged enough to do something, whether that's addressing that corporation, or that's addressing the policy that allows them to cause the harm that they do. The one thing that's also, and spurred by some of the original comments to my original tweet was the interest in actually what can we do. And so every day the thread ends with what can you do, and some kind of call to action, whether that's an action that is to change policy, signing a petition, calling your legislator, something like that, or it's simply an action to learn more. Because you cannot go advocate until you know what you're talking about. And so many of the calls to action are to learn more, and even some sprinkled here and there are just to take care of ourselves.
Yeah, so
And
that was going to be
maybe
the
spend
bulk
less
of,
time on Twitter.
yeah. Well, for those who are not tweeting, right? So the old heads who are
Right.
like, tweet, what is that, baby, you talking about? It's so amazing to have this where you can
Bird.
go and not only retweet it, honey, but screenshot it. Look at me screenshotting, stuff and being able to being able to share it with
Love it.
people who can use it practically every day, right? People who say, how can I get involved? What can I do? I don't like that this is going on. But I think one of the examples that you did was like 3M. Nobody knew. I didn't even know the scope of 3M and all of the different products that they had, coming out, and that, prison labor was being responsible for. Not because we get that old idea of just license plates, right? The prisoners in there, they're just like banging out license plates, right? But even with that being said, that is a job that they're not getting paid to do, that facility is benefiting from, that the state is benefiting from, and we need to hold them accountable, because there are people who are in society that need jobs that could probably use a license plate factory, and not only that, but I know in my work, we're thinking you've got some people in here and they've got child support payments that they need to pay. When I was talking to a young lady who had been formerly incarcerated, and she was talking about the fact that she had a balance. When she first got arrested, she went in with a balance because they drug tested her, and she's got to pay for that drug test. And by the time she got ready to get out, she had so much money that she owed that she couldn't even get money on her book. She was putting in somebody else's name because they were just taking it to go towards her balance, right? And so
Very
you've got
common.
these people waiting for, working for 86 cents an hour, I think you might have said, or
That's, that's generous. 86 cents a day is the
a
average.
day. Exactly. That's what it was. And if you're gonna do that, if they're gonna work, why can't it benefit society? Why can't it benefit their children, right? That's truly
Everyone. I mean, at the end of the day, slavery can't get us right. Like it just can't, right? Like there's no version of enslaving people. There's no version of the statement like they deserve it, right? There's no
Right.
like there's nothing that says this is how we make people whole. This
Come
is
on.
how we restore communities. This is how we heal trauma. This is how we rehabilitate people. This is how we, treat substance abuse. Like none of those is the answer to slavery.
Right.
To none of those, right? And a society that continues to promote slavery cannot be one held in high esteem, right? And that can't be proud of itself in that form, right? We have to say like we can't solve violence with violence, right? Like this is the type of thing that we're like trying to rebuff. And so we need to figure out how in 2022 to finally be able to say like no slavery, no exceptions.
Right.
And the fact that we're still having that conversation is really alarming, but critical. And I think, Linda, you bring up so many important issues regarding like how the economic instability of people who are inside affects their communities and their families on the outside, right?
Yeah.
That's really critical. I mean, many people are in prison because of economic instability, because of their, what they were doing to support their families, may or may not have been above bar. But taking that resource completely away from them and their families now leaves everyone in a hole, except for the state and others who are benefiting off their labor. And, just to close on the thought of the license plate, a lot of times what I try to do with both, hashtag prison and other of the like educational resources we put out at Worth Rises is to really get people to think a little bit below the surface, right? And think about the things that maybe they haven't. And so, for example, the question about license plates, sure, there's the conversation about who makes them and all of that. But then there's the question about like, where does the metal come from?
Material
Where
come from?
does the
If
laminate come from? Where does the,
mhm,
like, that material, because it doesn't just magically show up in the prison. It's there because somebody sold it to the prison
mhm,
knowing what it was going to be used for. And that's where 3M makes most of its money, by not necessarily, even though it does use prison labor in one prison in Minnesota where it's headquartered, the majority of its role in prison labor is not even the use, the explicit use of prison labor. It is the exploitation of that labor by serving correctional industries. And
mhm,
so really unpacking, what is a supply chain, not just down the supply chain, how does it get to us, but how does it, like, what's up the supply chain? Who are the suppliers, the manufacturers, before we even get to where does prison labor happen?
mhm,
Yeah, that secondary part is something I wanted to be sure to ask you about, and it is a sort of a deeper level of the surface. There are those sort of supply chain beneficiaries, right? And then there are all these sort of, I mean, you brought up banks as another one who are, providing loans. There are shareholders. I mean, it just seems disgusting to me that I would want to invest my money into a publicly traded company that's warehousing people or using
mm,
humans as inputs. But there's defense attorneys who have contracts with sheriff's offices who's, can't keep their detainees alive. There are consultants who are, brought in to get paid exorbitant hourly rates to quote unquote fix the problems that are systemic in these
There are
institutions.
insurance companies
There
that
Come
are
are
on now.
insurance companies. We could go.
Healthcare
So give
companies,
us,
yeah.
take us. Linda and I are probably a lot more than casually familiar with some of these, but take the listeners on a tour of this next level,
Yeah.
beyond the supply chain.
Absolutely. So oftentimes when you think about the prison industry, what we always hear, this is like the top three, and that's about as deep as it goes for,
Yeah.
for
Yep.
lay people. And it's like the top one is private prisons. People are like, that's bad, even though most people have no concept of how, like, common or not common they are. People generally think, oh, if we abolish private prisons, we like have won. We have not won anything, frankly, but it's an important step. We should do it. Then the next thing you hear about is prison labor, and everybody wants to talk about prison labor and how Victoria's Secret once upon a time used prison labor. Sure, all that's true. It doesn't anymore. And also, prison labor is important. We need to end slavery, all of these things. Also, not the end of the road with
No.
what the prison industry is.
Mhm,
Then you get some folks who might, if they have a direct experience, be familiar with prison telecom, let's say, or commissary, but basically these costs that are obviously borne in many cases by families. But again, that then being that like last sort of level, and you kind of really have to have familiarity with the system to even know about that. But that's where it ends.
Yeah.
And that is still just the tip of the iceberg,
mm,
right?
mhm, mm.
That the reality is there are companies that fund, let's say, construction and architecture companies that fund do campaign financing behind sheriffs so that they can get the construction contract to replace a jail, right? There are, as we were saying, right, the insurance companies behind police associations and police departments that help rebuff and fight families like yours, Linda, who lost a loved one, and negotiate how much that settlement should be and insure against that. Right? There are the muni bonds. There's the what we call like police brutality muni bonds in an organization called
Mhm.
Acre that's done incredible work around them. Right? And who issues those muni bonds? Not just obviously the municipality, but the underwriters, the banks who are helping them put out bonds to pay for police brutality. There are companies like Aramark that provide food
Mm.
services inside prisons and jails and have been repeatedly and consistently sued for all types of violations, unconstitutional, cruel, and unusual punishment stemming from food that has rodent
Right.
feces and body parts in it.
Ooh.
And nevertheless continue to operate. There are the healthcare companies that leave pregnant women to literally give birth in jail cells alone, right? And need to be held accountable, right? The list of corporations that are engaged in the prison industry in one way or another is extensive. Sometimes it feels endless, but it is a list that we need to be prying into more aggressively every single day so that our economy is not based on caging of people. And so what we like to say at Worth Rises is we want to shut down the industry and shift the economy away from caging and control of human beings.
Yeah. And I mean, that's just so powerful. I mean, like you said, again, knowledge is powerful. And a lot of people can't think past the very superficial things that we think about, like you said, telecom and commissary that are just right there in your face because it is so massive. And I tell you that, in this work that we do, trying to get people to actually buy into the vision of what public safety can mean without all of these layers, right? So now what do we shift to? Well, there are community-based, organizations that are ready and willing to take up these causes outside of the mass incarceration system, right? And so I love what you say about not making it profitable to detain people. And I think that's one of the things about reimagining. We've got to give them the vision, but they can't see the vision if they don't know the truth behind what's driving the monster in the first place. I always tell them that when they're targeting my neighborhood, when they're targeting my child, I know they're feeding the beast. The beast has to be fed, right? And then they buy into our fears that people are going to jump through our windows and kill us in our sleep, when the reality is that the majority of the people that are being detained in these facilities are there for lifestyle things. You know what I'm saying? Poverty driven things, right? And so this information is just so powerful. And I thank you so much for not only revealing the problem, but then saying, look, this is what you can personally do to get involved. Educate yourself and then disassociate you. Let these people know we're not doing business with you, which then opens up the door for more entrepreneurship, because we got to have somebody to replace these sons of bitches. These sons of bitches that's profiting, right? Yeah.
Well, if I can add, 100%. I mean, so a lot of times, and I know you've heard this before, right? Like, don't do the crime if you can't do the time, right? And all this stuff. A lot of times what I want to tell people, because this is like a really important part of the like economic beast, right? As you call it, Linda, which is who decides what's a crime?
Come on.
Yeah.
And why did they decide that it was a crime?
Right. This isn't just about the consequences of like what is currently considered a crime, but it's about who gets to decide what a crime is. So why is marijuana legalization taken as long as it has? Because there were three critical lobbies: alcohol, pharmaceuticals, and private prisons, that lobbied against marijuana legalization for more than a decade, right? And why? Because those three stood to lose if marijuana was legalized. Right now, we're seeing a lot of corporations, particularly storefronts, right, looking at larceny and felony larceny rules, right, and asking for the enforcement and more tough on crime type policies around larceny, right, theft from their stores. So again, they're trying to influence what is a crime and what level of a crime it should be in order to protect either their businesses or to feed their businesses in one way or another, right? So really understanding that even what is our criminal law is fed by corporate interests that get to decide those things, and not by policies that feed our public safety, as you said, right? And my sort of favorite example that I often give is ask yourself why, when you have insurance on your phone, right? Let's say your iPhone, your Android, whatever you got, you have insurance on your phone. And the idea is if your phone gets lost or stolen, you'll be able to get a new phone. It's the number one thing you need in order to get that insurance to actually give you a new phone. You've been paying them for 2 years a monthly fee to give you your new phone. And when you lose it or when you have it stolen, they want you to go to the cops. And they want you to get a letter from the police, a police report, you call it, to justify why they should give you what you
what you've
for.
been paying for. You better speak truth, girl.
Because you didn't trust me when I was paying that $10 every month.
That's right.
And the cops to validate me, that, like, our entire system is feeding corporations and financial institutions and greed every last way. And that is what the police literally back in the 1800s were set for: slave catching, protecting property, plantation owners, and all of that. And that's what they do today.
That's exactly right.
Are you sure you don't have like 40 more minutes for us just to tell you how wonderful we think your work is?
I'm just saying, girl. I'm just saying. I have totally forgotten about Mardi Gras. To hell with that. Let my people go. Set them free is what I'm talking about. In their minds, girl. You got to know, when I go down to Mobile Mardi Gras, and this is full disclosure for all of our podcast listeners, I'm talking about what I've talked about today. I'm sorry, Dave. Did I date our podcast? You're going
Nope. I'm not going to cut you off. You're on a roll. You're almost to 10. Linda's almost to 10. We're almost there. Linda's always worried I'm going to cut her off when she gets going. I'm like, this is the good stuff.
I was so excited to speak to you today. And I'm just thinking, oh my God, what an amazing woman you are. You know, what an amazing little force of nature that God has blessed us with in this earth to be able to help us with this Goliath, you know? And I just thank you so much for heeding that call. I am so sorry for what you had to go through that brought you to this place, because I know you spoke about the murder of your boyfriend when you were, 15 years old. And I know the pain of losing someone close and how that is a daily thing, but it's a North Star as well, as my Lamar is for me and my family. And the work that you have done has moved us forward.
Thank you both so much. It's really been a pleasure talking to you both. And I'm so excited for, the work, Linda, that you're doing and your podcast, both of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.